Does California have what Republicans want?
So yeah, this is actually really interesting on multiple levels. In California, you actually have more money left over after taxes are taken out as well. Not only that, but you have more money left over after rent is taken out as well. It's actually safer to live in too. California is doing much better than Texas in firearm-related deaths. Same with deaths caused by DUI. Texas also has a higher suicide rate than California does. And by the way, when it comes to family values, California's infant mortality rate is much lower than Texas's. California's maternal mortality rate is also much lower than Texas. Yet Texas has one of the most strict abortion laws in the country. And then, after you finally do have the baby, California also ranks much better in percentage of food insecure adults. And it ranks much, much better in percentage of food insecure children, which means in Texas, not only do you pay more in taxes, you also can't afford as much. It's more dangerous to live in Texas, and then it's more dangerous to have a baby in Texas. And then after you do have the baby, it's much more likely that you won't be able to feed the baby or yourself.
So this TikTok by That Nick Powers Down really brings the number, pointing out the simple fact that people in California actually end up paying a lot less in taxes than people in Texas do. But how could this possibly be? Because Texas doesn't have an income tax. Well, it turns out that the income tax isn't the only tax that people pay. It also turns out that a state government has a lot of things that it needs to pay for, which means it's got to get the taxes somewhere. Only when you have a state that is so avowedly right-wing, they will end up doing everything within their power to not tax corporations. And while they don't tax individuals through income tax, there's plenty of other ways like property taxes or sales tax for the government to get their money from you. And so it turns out when you add all of those things together, that people in Texas end up paying more in taxes than people in California do. But the representatives in Texas don't really care, because it's working people that are paying those taxes as individuals. And corporations are allowed to continue to make a profit without that much government scrutiny or taxation. Because really, that's what it's all about. Giving as much handouts to corporations as they possibly can, while making regular working class people pay the cost. That's why the Texas power grid, of all power grids across the country, is quite literally the worst, and basically has no capability to deal with extreme weather, whether it be hot or cold. Because fundamentally, the state is so invested in ensuring private profits at the expense of everything else that their energy provider was actually able to profit off of disaster and use a snowstorm as an excuse to jack up rates. And so people in Texas ended up paying astronomical bills. But that's not a bug in their system, that is a feature. The same can be said with high crime rates and things like that. Because while we understand crime to be a bad thing, you see, the more dangerous it is to live in society, the more money people are going to want to spend on things like police. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a whole industry in the United States built around giving as much high-tech weaponry to police officers as possible. And so all that surveillance technology and weaponry and tanks and vehicles and whatnot that police officers get, that's a lot of money dumped into the pockets of wealthy individuals that own those companies that produce those things. And so they love it when crime is high. And so Republicans love it when crime is high, because it's an easy way to scare people into pushing for reactionary policies, to scare people away from pushing towards any type of policy that might be innovative or new, and for giant companies to make a buck in the process. And there's an added layer to this too, because gun manufacturers really love selling this idea of home defense. And so they love crime and violent deaths too, because the more people that die from gun violence, the more people will feel like they need a gun to protect themselves. And they spin these narratives about crime alongside narratives about needing a gun for self-defense and home protection. And that allows the whole weapons manufacturing industry to make a buck too. So does California have what Texas wants? Does it have lower taxes and safer streets? It turns out that it actually does. But if you go one step further and actually look at socialist countries instead of just states within capitalist countries, which California is, and by the way, the Democratic Party is very much a right-wing party that is in favor of capitalism. Just important to note. But if you look at socialist countries, you'll realize that when the government is fully willing and capable of suppressing capitalist exploitation, when you have a government that is not just marginally putting some restrictions on capitalists or putting some regulations in place that protects people, but when the state is actually interested in having an adversarial role with capitalists themselves, they are interested in directly suppressing capitalist exploitation, you get things like what they have in Cuba, where they have a longer life expectancy than the United States, and China, which now has a longer life expectancy than the United States. Both countries of which have a 90% or above home ownership rate, which is far higher than the United States home ownership rate, around 60%. And then Cuba and China both have incredibly low crime rates. On top of the fact that homelessness in Cuba is almost entirely eradicated, and homelessness in China is far less of an issue than it is in the United States. All while at the same time, both countries have far lower incarceration rates than the United States. So if you're talking about the opportunity to own your own home, get an education, live a comfortable life, and raise a family, all with freedom from state intervention or the threat of being arrested, I have good news for you. If that's your image of the American dream, then the American dream is alive and well in socialist countries around the world. It just turns out that it's not so much alive in the United States.